I'm Jason Bradford.
I'm Cher Miller.
And I'm Rob Dietz. Welcome to Crazy Town, where you're not invited to join our exclusive team of bloviating know-it-all podcast hosts.
Hi, this is Crazy Town producer Melody Allison. Thanks for listening. Here in Season 6, we're exploring escape routes, pathways that just might get us out of Crazy Town. In today's episode, Jason, Rob, and Cher are escaping Otherism. And here's a quick warning. Sometimes this podcast uses swear words.
Language!
If you like what you're hearing, please let some friends know about Crazy Town. Now, on to the show.
Hey Jason, hey Cher. We have a tough topic today, so I want to start somewhere benign. Is that all right with you?
Let's ease into this, please.
Yeah, I was like dip our toes in the nice warm water.
So you're saying this is tougher than extremism, which we did last.
Well, that was pretty tough, but I'm going to say yeah.
Really?
I found this
Sweet.
tough.
Awesome.
So what I want to start with is how much I love reading to children.
Oh.
Like when my daughter was a
Doesn't sound too
4-year-old,
bad.
I really loved it.
Yeah.
So I feel like I'm pretty well versed in the children's authors and the children's books. But you guys, who's the best? Who's the greatest of all time when it comes to children's authors?
Roald Dahl.
Who wrote Hansel and Gretel?
I don't know. Is that one of those? I was going to say Aesop's fables, but that's not right.
Brothers Grimm?
Hans Christian Andersen.
Oh, yeah,
Brothers
that would have been
Grimm.
Hans Christian
I don't
Andersen.
remember.
God, we're just...
Yeah.
Roald Dahl.
We are so erudite.
I know. Roald Dahl is a
That's a
good
good one.
answer, but
I loved Roald Dahl.
you could at least make the case that it's Dr. Seuss. Right?
Oh, yeah.
Totally.
And I read a lot of Dr. Seuss books. You guys?
Yeah.
I memorized Cat in the Hat. I might even be able to do most of it now.
Wow.
Keep reading to my boys. Yeah.
That is
Read that one a lot.
impressive. I once did a presentation on ecological economics completely based on the Lorax.
That's the classic, of course.
Well,
Well, and then they made a great film, and
I didn't see the
all the
movie.
wonderful giveaways that they had. The one with the film.
They always do that. Green Eggs and Ham was a highlight probably for me.
Cher, probably when you were a kid, you must have loved The Grinch Who Stole Christmas.
Yeah, I read it to myself every day. No, we had Yip and Janneke. That's what I grew up with.
What?
These two Dutch characters, two Dutch kids.
Oh.
Yip and Janneke. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And
Good.
Janneke, of course, that's a pretty bad rhyme with Hanukkah. Is that the...
Dude, Dutch and Jewish are not the same thing.
Okay.
Okay?
Well, and of course, if anyone who's graduating, a common gift is, oh, the places you'll go.
Yeah, that's kind of a...
That's gotten to be
That's
bad.
a yawn fest.
Well, one of my favorites, I wanted to bring this up. There was this guy during the COVID pandemic, this guy, Wes Tank. He's some sort of multimedia artist, and he started taking Dr. Dre and other rap tunes, and he would read various Dr. Seuss books over it.
Wow.
So,
I never came across this.
yeah, well, I sent to Cher a clip. Can you play that for us? Wes Tank doing Fox and Socks.
And here's a new trick, Mr. Knox. It's called Socks on Chicks and Chicks on Fox. Fox on clocks on bricks and blocks. Bricks and blocks on knocks on box. Now we come to...
I love that guy. Like, he's kind of goofy, but somehow seems like a...
Pretty hardcore rapper for sure.
Well, and he seems almost like a dad reading to his kid, but in a way more entertaining way than any of us did. You know?
Okay.
But I got to kind of steer us to our actual topic of the day. And
can't we just stay here?
Well, we're going to
Silver
stay in
stories?
Dr. Seuss world here.
Oh,
for a
okay.
little
Okay.
bit.
Okay.
So one of my favorites that I read over and over and over again is the Sneetches.
I remember the Sneetches.
I don't remember the Sneetches.
Okay.
Funny looking critters.
Yeah, they're sort of these...
Dr. Seuss.
You would like them, Jason. They're kind of bird-like,
Yeah.
sort of maybe based off an ostrich or
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
But
Yellow.
he published this in 1961, and basics are the Sneetches get divided into two groups, one that has stars on their bellies and the others that have no stars upon theirs. And the stars weren't very big. They were quite small. Anyway, what happened is the Starbelly Sneetches would brag, "We're the best kind of Sneetches on the beaches." And with their snoots in the air, they would sniff and they'd snort. "We'll have nothing to do with the plain belly sort." So anyway, story goes on. The
You
star.
should wrap that for us.
Yeah, I know. We should get Wes Tank on
Yeah.
this program.
Yeah.
But the star-bellied Sneetches think they're superior. They get all the perks in society while denying them to the plain-belly Sneetches. And then what happens? A capitalist enters the scene. This guy, Sylvester McMonkey McBean, and
Nice.
he offers to help the starless Sneetches. He's got this machine that'll basically tattoo their bellies.
Nice.
Right?
Yeah.
And they think, yeah, I'll just pay this guy, and then I'll be part of the in-group. And doesn't work out that way. The original Starbelly then pay McBean to have their stars.
So he's
removed.
making money.
Oh,
He's
God.
making money left and right.
Both ways.
Yeah, he's playing the one side off the other.
He's a great capitalist.
Ah.
Great capitalist. And anyway, eventually he gets all their money, leaves town, and they realize the error of their ways, and all Sneetches are created equal. And they,
so it ends well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big group hug on the beach.
On the beach.
That's because they had someone to hate McBean, right?
Yeah, they had a common out group. Good for them now.
Yeah. Hi, Rob here with a short post-production editorial note. As you just heard, we kicked off this episode on othering with a riff on Dr. Seuss. Although we didn't bring it up in the moment, it would be a bit odd not to mention Dr. Seuss's own complicated past with othering. In his political cartoons and even some of his children's books, he sometimes used racial stereotypes. His estate even pulled 6 of his books out of print. This controversy around Dr. Seuss actually dovetails pretty well with the analysis we're about to share regarding susceptibility to othering and how people can change for the better. Thanks. Well, I think that's a pretty good short little Dr. Seuss parable for where we're headed. So, Cher, tell us what we're talking about today.
We're talking about otherism, or I guess we could use the more common way of describing it, othering.
Yeah.
And maybe we should start by defining what we mean by that. I'm going to turn to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights because we've read lots of different definitions. Rob, you did a deep dive on this, and some of the definitions were a bit academic. So we decided to pick one that was a little bit more accessible.
Understandable.
It's worth othering those academic types. Put them in a box
Those
in a corner.
academics.
Yeah.
And
That's never happened to academics
Just
before anywhere
lower
in the
your
world.
snoots.
right.
According to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, othering consists of 2 steps. First step being categorizing a group of people according to perceived differences, such as ethnicity or skin color or religion, gender, sexual orientation, that kind of thing. And the second step is identifying that group as inferior and using an us versus them mentality to alienate the group.
And I want to just point out that we really want to also recognize that differences can be okay. And in other words, the recognition of differences can be okay. I want to talk about this because
Right, so it's step 2, maybe that's the problem
the
here.
step 2 is the problem here. So I think we should talk a little bit about the step 1 is something that actually can be quite normal and appropriate. So, for example, you can have benign in-groups that are around common interests. Like, I've got tennis buddies and I've got birding friends, right? But that does imply an out-group. There are people that aren't very good at tennis and that I don't play tennis with.
Like people like me who just think birds are absolute the worst thing that's ever happened.
I would love to go birding
First
with
of
you.
all,
That'd be fine.
I don't like the way you labeled some people as not being good at tennis, okay? Can we just dial it back a little bit?
I'm sorry about that. Maybe they have pickleball. That's fine for them. Okay?
Ouch. Shots fired.
So the question is like, when does it go from healthy to unhealthy, right? And I also think when we walk around in the world and have to interact with people, we use categorizations to understand how we should behave towards other people in ways that might be very appropriate. So it's not just common interests, but there may be reasons of politeness and social norms, like opening a door for an elderly person who is, having trouble maybe. You're just observing differences and saying, okay, this is a nice, polite thing to do. Or maybe actually someone could be a threat. There could be plenty of signs that that other person is threatening to you and you should avoid or you should, deflect somehow. So there's a lot of reasons why we should think about others and differentiate, but do this in ways that are appropriate. So what do we call this, right? We call this classification, right? And that brings up my false prophet taxonomy, which I think was a wonderful...
That was definitely a form of othering that you practiced there with that classification.
Well, let's just give listeners who didn't listen to the False Prophets season just a quick taste. So Jason came up with a whole taxonomic classification for different kinds of people who are telling us all the wrong things, right?
Yeah. So, was there something wrong with that? Was that othering?
Well,
what's wrong with punching up, right?
I'm pretty sure we may have said some pretty derogatory things about eco-modernists.
Yeah.
I mean...
Yeah, where do we draw the line? Like, should we be punishing ourselves a little or feeling bad about how we behaved that season?
Here's the weird thing. Like, you think of othering, one of the things would be dehumanizing somebody else. And the weird thing is, in your false prophet taxonomy, some of those false prophets were trying to dehumanize themselves, right? Yeah. They wanted to be uploaded in the cloud. Yes. They want machines for bodies.
Well, I created other species of humans, but I didn't dehumanize. They were all part of the human family, right? I mean, was that okay? I don't know.
It's probably how we spoke of them as being... And this gets to what we mean by othering as something that we need to escape, right? Mm-hmm. So othering involves zeroing in on a difference, using that difference to dismantle a sense of similarity, familiarity, connectedness between different people, right?
Okay.
It sets the stage for discrimination or persecution.
Right.
Because it reduces empathy. It prevents like a genuine dialogue.
I think we tried to strongman people in that season.
Yeah.
And we often found empathy with them. Remember how often we said, "God, I can see how they came up with these ideas."
Ray Kurzweil seemed to be kind of a nice dude who just went off the deep end.
Even the ones who didn't seem very nice, we could
there's
uncover there was trauma in their past. And it's like, oh, you're probably responding to trauma,
to you,
and so you have empathy for that.
Did we have a lot of empathy for Elon Musk? I'm not sure that we did.
I think I did at the end a little bit, but it was hard. Some people, they go so far that they're such extremists, in other words. So I guess how do we deal with extremists?
I think the point here is, I think what you're saying, Jason, is if we're trying to address or escape othering or otherism, we do have to recognize that seeing difference, recognizing difference, and actually in some cases embracing difference is not a bad thing.
Right.
It's what we do with that recognition or that differentiation sometimes where it turns into a negative, right?
Sure.
It's viewed as a negative. It's used as a tool to ostracize or to persecute people that are different than us. That's where we go wrong. It's not the fact that there are differences between people.
I embrace the ability to talk about these differences, actually, and to have a debate with people that have different ideas.
Well, you mentioned to share that I did a little bit of a deep dive. And while I was on this quest to understand othering, I came across this model that looks at stereotyping and othering and how people's perceptions of others color how they treat them.
Okay.
And this is it struck me. So this model, I'll try to describe it. It's very simple. It's kind of a 4-quadrant model, and you classify how you perceive an outgroup on 2 characteristics of that outgroup.
Okay.
So you perceive they're either low competence or high competence.
Okay.
And on the other axis, they're either high warmth or low warmth. Warmth here meaning like friendly.
Likability.
Cooperative kind of. So if you look at the groups, how much you think they're competent and how warm you think they are, you could place people in a quadrant. And so when an in-group sees low competence but high warmth, these are groups like elderly and disabled folks. And the way that the in-group then treats the out-group is kind of with a sense of pity, right? And it can get kind of worse from there. Like if the in-group views a group as being high competence but low in warmth, they might view that group with envy. And in America, what fits that category are Asians and Jews. And then you got the low competence, low warmth, which might be the most dangerous, where the in-group views those people with disgust or contempt. And I was just thinking about this, like there's so many shades or flavors of othering. And I thought, I think I've been susceptible to the quadrant with pity. I'm othering elderly people thinking, oh, wow, that must really suck being you or what.
I think you definitely see that with people who are differently abled or disabled. And another interesting thing for me is thinking about like how Jews are perceived. In some cases, there is the sort of low warmth, high competence, but there's other cases where it's actually low warmth and low competence. And so there are groups that are viewed in multiple ways.
Yeah, and of course, this is just a model, so it's not going to fit reality perfectly. But I was just surprised in reading it. It just made me think about myself and my own problematic ways of seeing the world, and recognizing that othering is something that I don't think anybody is immune to.
No,
that. The categorizing thing that you were mentioning, Jason, is in all of us,
Right.
And then it's not that big a leap to get to negative connotations of othering.
I worked really hard to overcome my othering of light-skinned people who would turn red in the sun.
Yeah.
Easily.
That's me and
sad.
Jason. Pretty bad. on
Yeah.
that
I was
front.
definitely seeing you guys as low competence.
Sure.
It took me a while to get from low warmth to high warmth.
First
for
of
you.
all,
Well, I agree.
what happens in the sun to us doesn't have anything to do with our competence. We're incompetent.
Yeah, you have other
Yeah,
reasons.
I can be in the shade and be incompetent.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so let's talk about what is sort of the ways we are susceptible to othering. Why do people do this? And we can think of it in sort of three main ways. One is to make sense of the world. And we've talked about this in other episodes, of course, is that people are attracted to the moral clarity of binary opposites like us versus them, and seeking the straightforwardness to understand something. What is my in-group? What is my out-group? They want to see how they fit into this larger world. And it's this reduction of complexity and seeking of simplicity.
Yeah, you're right. Over and over, we say it's not black and white. It's gray and it's nuanced.
Right.
And
The brain doesn't like
but
that.
we don't like
hate
that.
that.
Yeah, we want an answer. Damn it.
Yeah.
I remember being frustrated in math class when there was no, I want the answer to be 2 or 3.
I think math is one of those places where it's a lot easier.
It's a lot easier to get
Yeah,
it.
maybe so.
A simple answer. Yeah.
I was in way more advanced math
Yeah,
than
obviously.
you guys were.
You were dealing with imaginary numbers.
La-di-da.
Imperfect numbers.
Fancy pants here.
So one of the second main reasons that people get drawn into othering is to enhance their own social position. So through othering, people try to put themselves kind of higher in the social hierarchy. And I mean, I could see that, like, I'm so low class, but I try to find somebody who's worse off and other them so that I can feel a little better about myself.
Is that even
I guess.
possible for you?
It's not possible for me.
Okay.
I mean, I'm at the bottom looking up, okay?
Yeah.
We talked about this on our episode on escaping extremism, but there can also be this tendency towards malignant bonding, right? And that's people engaging in othering because they see it as a path to finding their own belonging, which is kind of ironic,
It's
right?
totally ironic,
Yeah.
right? It's like, you're going to be an out group so that I can belong to this group that makes you an out group?
Well, I think it's recognizing that there is a deep-seated need to belong and bond, right? It probably
survival.
It is a survival strategy. It's deep in our evolutionary biology. And so sometimes it takes the form, and people have preyed on this, as we talked about that in our episode on extremism, where people prey on that need to provide a place of belonging for people by focusing their energy and attention towards others, right? And their antipathy towards those. The great novelist Toni Morrison once asked, quote, "What is the nature of othering's comfort, its allure, its power? Is it the thrill of belonging, which implies being part of something bigger than one's solo self?" And I think that speaks exactly to that.
Yeah, it's, I guess, othering, belonging, two sides of the same coin, maybe.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The duality.
I'm telling you, this is a tough episode.
This is really tough. I'm struggling already.
Well, let's get to the not tough part,
Okay.
which we've joked throughout this season that we like sharing our personal experience with the ism du jour.
Okay.
So,
And our own hypocrisy.
yeah.
Sometimes,
Yes.
let's be honest.
so I thought maybe we could share some personal experiences with othering and some takeaways that we got out of that. And I want to share. I got to go back to high school because
Nice.
that is
Glory
the,
days.
That's the place
That's when he
of,
peaked.
Well,
Yeah.
Oh, I so did not peak in high school, let me tell you. But that's the place for the best othering that I can think of. I mean,
Middle school is pretty bad too.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, you
You're more
guys
sophisticated.
you probably forget I didn't have middle school. Like we went from K to 7 and then straight to 8 through 12. So I was an 8th grader in a high school.
That's rough.
Yeah.
Boy, before you tell your story, could I just share something that struck me talking about middle school? Yeah. I moved across the country in the middle of my 7th grade year, right? It was over winter break. I moved from Philadelphia to Portland, Oregon. And this is going to sound like a bad John Hughes line or something. The first thing a person said to me when I showed up at school, they asked me, was I a carp or a Soch? And I had no idea what the hell that meant.
I don't even know.
And a carp was someone who was poor. Okay. And a Soch was someone who was rich.
Wow, but that's straight out of The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. But it's the Soches and the Greasers. I never heard of the term carp.
Wow.
And I'm not making this up. This is the first thing that was said to me. So talk about othering.
That's what I'm saying. So, okay, I'm in high school, and the best class I took was a course called Modern World Affairs. It was this cool social studies class where you try to understand what's going on in the world. And the teacher at one point had this game that she set up for the class where she divided us into 4 groups. So each student group had like 6 or 7 kids in it. And it was almost like a reality TV show, right? Like Survivor or something, where we would do these contests. One of them was who could make a paper airplane that would fly the farthest. And when you won, you basically became the top dog, and you got to set the rules. So basically, I ended up in the group that was the worst. We were the poor.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, you were carps.
I mean, I was in it, so I dragged us down, right away.
Yeah.
So the rules of the game. That's not really even, who cares? What's amazing to me is what happened. So one of my best friends was in the group that kind of rose to the top.
The Soch.
And they got to rule over us carps.
Yes.
And it was nuts. Like my friend kind of became a dick.
It's like the Stanford prison experiment.
Yeah, it's kind of like that. Like it was amazing that I just felt like, what are you doing? And there was a clear othering from them, but then I also started feeling like, well, these guys are jackasses. Why are they acting like that?
Did you get along later with a friend? Is it?
Yeah, okay? We made up, but
after he burned his house down.
But the point is, how fast?
Arbitrary.
How fast do you start othering?
It's totally arbitrary.
Yeah,
but look at it. How quickly? I mean, we're good friends in all of the rest of life, but in this stupid ass game in a stupid ass high school with us stupid ass kids. Like, we're going to treat each other like garbage.
Every once in a while, someone gets too serious about a board game like Risk or like, what's the one where you take over the worlds? Whatever.
I once got called I hope you fucking die, you fucker, for winning at Risk.
Yeah. Or Monopoly or something like that. You get too caught up in it. Yeah.
Okay, well, so that's you being, in some ways, a victim of othering. By the way, if that's your worst experience of othering in life, it's
that's pretty good.
You've had a pretty good life.
Just quick time out.
I'm not trying to shit on you.
This section was not your worst experience of othering.
Right.
This was a personal experience of othering.
Fair enough. I'm going to own some of the ways that I have a tendency to other in my own life. So I have become less and less patient and understanding with people who like to rev their engines, drive motorcycles that don't have mufflers on them, basically be loud.
Big
and
ass
obnoxious.
trucks.
Yeah. And I have a tendency to sort of look at anyone who has one of those and immediately make assumptions about them.
Yes.
Look at them in a certain negative light.
Yes.
Because
I do this.
of that experience.
I'm following you. I'm getting worked up right now.
And it could be that there are people who belong to that group in the sense of they have a huge truck, let's say.
Yes.
And it turns out what they use that truck for is, for example, the guy who came to our house when we cut down our disease trees, and he spent hours and hours and hours cutting down the felled trees into little pieces, not even that little, to turn it to firewood for people who are too poor. No, but the point is, I could have looked at that guy with his huge truck and thought, this guy's an asshole. Right? turns out he's a wonderful human being, and he has that big truck because he's actually helping people who live in parts of this county that don't have enough money for.
I think you're making. I differentiate between people just have a big truck versus those who obviously have disabled the pollution control and basically like. Aggressively come up behind you and then like pass you, and then they like all the black smoke comes out and they race down the streets of my neighborhood for no reason other than to make noise.
Look, I don't want to rain on your old man
practicing
angst
right
parade, but I do think, and this maybe goes to do the opposite, which was later in the show, but you could just be angry at the technology instead of at the people. That's a possibility, right?
Well, it's to Jason's point. The people that are intentionally making noise to get attention.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, when I see a big truck, I shouldn't assume that everyone is like that.
I think I agree with that. Okay. All right. So my thing, I don't do this so much anymore, but back in the day, college, I would make fun of, get amped up about, and debate creationists whenever I could. I kind of enjoyed it.
How did that go for you?
Well, I never changed their mind, but it was fun to. It was kind of fun in some cases. So the best time I had doing this was there was a billboard in St. Louis, Missouri, by this guy named Dr. Dino, who was offering a $250,000 reward for proof of evolution. And I had just gotten my PhD in evolutionary biology, or I was about to. I was like in my last year or whatever. And we had this thing called the Darwin Party at my grad school, where we organized on February 12th or the nearest weekend or whatever, a birthday party for Charles Darwin. And we would have like drinks, mixed drinks themed of the different places that the HMS Beagle traveled to. You know, we had cakes that were shaped of animals that were
nerds.
It was completely nerded out.
Culminated in someone being handed the Darwin Award after they
That was
they had
true.
too much to drink and it fell off.
Well, we had a
building.
Darwin Film Festival too, where we would make movies on any kind of Darwin theme or evolution theme. So I did this whole thing where I
really want to other your group right now.
well, I did this thing where I actually interviewed this guy, Kent Hovind, aka Dr. Dino, in Pensacola, Florida. And I spent like an hour on the phone with him trying to figure out the rules for his contest and how I might win. And recorded it using Radio Shack technologies at the time. And it was a total hit. Like, it was a hoot. I basically trolled the shit out of this guy. And everyone was just laughing hysterically at what he said and how I would kind of lead him on calmly and make him say stupid stuff.
I don't feel like you've
Learned a lesson.
Yeah,
out of
you've
this?
gotten like over your othering ways. I feel like you would gladly break out your Radio Shack technology and talk to Dr. Dino some
My
more.
takeaway is it can be a lot of fun to troll wackos. You know, it really can be a grand time.
That's great. How does this help us escape othering?
I don't know. I'm just saying, like, obviously I'm susceptible.
Okay, so
Obviously.
you're taking some ownership.
I'm
over
taking
that.
some. You tried to take ownership, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's
I don't hear a mea culpa in here.
No,
but okay.
I don't know what to do about this. I think they're just ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, just it's a good point. We're all vulnerable to doing this. So let's dive a little bit into the history of othering. As Cher said, I did a little deep dive. I read Belonging Without Othering, How We Save Ourselves in the World. It's a new book by John A. Powell and Stephen Menendian out of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. And something they said, a big statement about history, is there's no known human society over all of history that's free from the dynamics that marginalize or stigmatize particular social groups. So, Jason, maybe you're in the clear a little bit with your treatment of Dr. Dino and company.
Yeah.
But this was an interesting side point to that, is that even though othering occurs everywhere and across time, there's also no natural or inevitable other. Like the who is the other goes all over the map from place to place, and there's no set rules or common patterns there. So in other words, people conduct othering in different ways in towards different groups of people.
Sure.
So it may be that, we're talking about escaping othering. Maybe it's recognizing it's not something we can completely escape from, but try to navigate and manage in some ways, right?
Yeah.
But I do think we have to recognize and name and combat the truly dangerous and vile forms of othering that's happened. And a lot of it does, when we're talking about the history, comes from the playbook of colonizers, right? We talked about this in our season on watershed moments. I think it was episode 51, where we talked about the papal bulls and the doctrines of Christian discovery. And in a sense, that was the papacy rubber stamping, authorizing the Spanish government, the Portuguese government, and others to go out and conquer and divide up Muslim and pagan lands, to authorize slavery, authorize exploitation of the natural world. They codified that, basically.
Yes.
And led to a sort of a playbook of doing this around the world.
Yeah. And I think that, that ties into economics, of course, too. So in that season, related to these watershed moments, we talk about this as well, and this was covered really well in the Seeing White podcast. There's a really interesting teachings of Suzanne Plisick of the Racial Equity Institute, and the story of sort of what is defined as a different race, or what is an inferior race versus superior race. It can't be separated from the story of labor. And rich landowners in colonial America needed this reliable, consistent labor force. And they didn't want labor forces that were poor bonding about their social status. And so they pitted, white laborers against these racial African immigrant slaves.
Indentured white slaves with chattel, those in chattel slavery.
And so that prevented sort of coming together because of class solidarity, right? So this is how othering can be used in power dynamics to sort of to prop up the status quo and those in power.
Yeah, and this is where it gets so heavy. It's just even hard to think about all the examples throughout history and into today of this sort of divide and conquer approach that colonizers have used. Maybe more recent example and horrendous is the genocide that happened in Rwanda about 30 years ago. The numbers are staggering. As many as 800,000 people were slaughtered, and mostly one ethnic group, the Tutsis, were killed by another ethnic group, the Hutu. But the whole tension between them was initiated by the colonizing forces. The Belgians kind of gave the Tutsis these positions of power, largely based on skin color.
Yeah, and so starting in the late 1930s, I think, or after World War I or something like that, is when they set up that dynamic. And then it really culminated 60 years later in this genocide.
That to me is we're going to talk about the consequences of othering, but that's getting at it. You start something moving at a point in history, and it can end in utter tragedy and violence like that.
And unfortunately, we see that playbook still being adopted by those in power, and it can work across political structures, right? I mean, you see it in places in the world where you have authoritarian regimes who find an other to pick on and to shine a light on as a scapegoat for the problems that the populace might feel because they don't have economic opportunity or civil rights of any kind. But you can also see it in democracies, where people rise to power because they played on the fears of or tensions between different groups. And unfortunately, that playbook really works because of what we were talking about before, which is this maybe innate tendency in us to other difference.
Yes.
Right?
Well, let's really bring it to what's happening today in our culture and some examples of the worrisome signs of othering. And I want to recognize that this is not just something that happens on the right, and it can even happen between groups that have been othered in the past. So, for example, there is this tendency now of trans activists calling certain feminists TERFs, which stands for trans exclusionary radical feminists. And so certain feminists bring up concerns about trans women in college and professional sports or in bathrooms prior to full transition, and how this might affect women who maybe are really scared of men for whatever, have been traumatized themselves. And so they're trying to have conversations about this and get shut down or get yelled at. And so it's ironic in that, people that have been working around women's rights issues for a long time are now getting called out or, abused in some cases by trans women or advocates for trans women.
Yeah, that's rough. And you're right. It's not just for the right wing, but let's be real. The right wing's really good at othering from time to time. There's a certain leader in recent U.S. history, Mr. Donald J. Trump, who has used othering kind of to its fullest extent in his remarks. I can give a couple of direct quotes. He had this remark about immigrants where he said, "You wouldn't believe how bad these people are. These aren't people. These are animals." And then he had a recent one in a 2023 campaign event in November where he said, "We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country." Now, he already kind of went to these people and the
animals,
the thugs, but then he's really good. He takes it another step further, right? He completely dehumanizing. I mean, vermin has a horrid history, and when you start hearing that kind of speech, you're on the way toward that much more dangerous consequence.
Well, the irony is he says root out the fascists, but this is classic fascism speech right here.
Yeah, he was talking about himself there.
And then this gets to the power of language and the use of language to other. Mm-hmm. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, comparing people to animals, for example.
Yes.
Which is also an implicit othering of animals.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
But
don't forget our episode on humanocentrism where we said, hey, it's a community of life, okay?
Right.
But people can define communists or Marxists or, it's like they use these terms to just attach them to people because they've got negative connotation where it's like this person's
the people
not a
they're
Marxist.
talking to has no clue what they're
who can define vermin anymore? Like, who uses that word? What is that supposed to mean?
Vermin supreme. Great presidential candidate.
Okay, so I don't want to give you guys like really bad flashbacks, but do you remember our episode on Mark Andreessen?
Very well.
Yeah, with his techno-optimist manifesto.
That sent me down a rabbit hole.
This is the guy who thinks that the precautionary principle is like the worst thing ever. It's evil. Right. Well, I want to introduce you to another Silicon Valley visionary, Balaji Srinivasan, who Andreessen described as having, quote unquote, the highest rate of output per minute of good new ideas of anybody I've ever met. So
that's a great metric. He's measured the metric.
Andreessen, loves this guy.
Oh,
right?
wow.
I want to know who has the highest output per second of good ideas. I mean, minute. Come on. We're talking Silicon Valley. You got to be fast.
Time is money here. Well, last year, Balaji went on a podcast called The Moment of Zen to share.
Sounds mellow.
Yeah, it's a moment of Zen, but it was like 4 hours long. To share his utopian vision for a tech-governed city where citizens loyal to tech companies would form a new political tribe clad in gray T-shirts. I'm not making this up.
And this is San Francisco he's talking about. The city is San Francisco.
Yeah. So, and I'm going to quote here, "And if you see another gray on the street, right?
Yeah.
You do the nod," he said. "You're a fellow gray."
I'm sorry, but I keep thinking of those gray aliens, from...
Why did he pick gray?
I don't know. It's like the worst color. I guess it's neutral. Anyone can wear it.
Are you guys, grays? That's a term for the alien, like the archetype of alien. So if UFOs come down and aliens abduct you, they're called grays because they're sort of gray in body and they got the black eyes.
Interesting.
Okay.
I'm hearing a conspiracy theory boiling up here.
Well, we want to up our ratings on this podcast.
Oh, okay.
This is an episode about UFOs,
Bigfoot,
and the Illuminati,
and tech bros.
So
as Gil Duran at the New Republic described Balaji's vision, grays would receive special ID cards, providing them access to exclusive gray-controlled sectors of the city.
Oh my gosh.
The Greys would make an alliance with the police department, funding weekly policemen's banquets to win them over.
Nice.
That means policemen are going to be dressed in gray instead of blue, right?
I guess they have a policeman's ball every week. I don't know. Everyone would be welcome to the Gray Pride March. Not the Gay Pride March.
Hey,
the Gray
I got to
Pride
hand
March.
it to them. That's cool.
Classic.
Yeah.
Everyone that is except the blues. Okay. And Srinivasan defines the blue political tribe as the liberal voters he implies are responsible for the city's problems, right? And they're going to be completely banned from gray-controlled zones, but the Republicans, who are reds, they're allowed in, right? Red should be welcome there. There's a quote, "Red should be welcome there, and people should wear their tribal colors." He compared his color-coded apartheid system to the Bloods and Crips gang rivalry. No blues should be welcomed here.
This
dude.
rings so many alarms. Like, first of all, who wants to emulate the Bloods and Crips gang rivalry?
Yeah, this is a Silicon Valley venture capitalist CEO who gets hours and hours
Who people
on
take him
popular
seriously.
podcasts.
Yeah, take him seriously.
Who billion-dollar CEOs call him the greatest idea producer permitted of anyone. This is scary as hell. This is a tech fascist nightmare right here.
It's also unoriginal. We've already had a war with blues and grays. That was called the Civil War. Okay, can we?
remember Kurzweil, where you'd have the gray bots and the blue bot, the gray the gray goo and the blue.
I think it was the red.
Okay,
the blue was the police.
The police bots, nanobots would try to keep you. They were blue bots. They would go after the gray nanobots.
You sound insane.
Yeah, where are we?
And you're quoting Kurzweil.
Pretty much.
Yeah. Okay.
They live in they float in the same circles, I think.
So you're right, though. That's a dangerous sounding othering that's being taken seriously.
Right now, this is going on in San Francisco.
And Trump is doing his thing, too.
And Trump is kind of nuts. It makes my creationist thing look very pedestrian, doesn't it?
It sure does.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm going to go back to high school and modern world affairs.
Okay, so let's talk about what the consequences are for this. Of course, there's health effects. We covered this in the episode on individualism. Being othered leads to isolation and loneliness. It takes a toll on your mental and physical health. And remember, we talked about that being socially isolated is like taking up smoking or not exercising in terms of its health effects.
Yeah,
right.
That's great.
And, of course, as we discussed in our episode on extremism, you see hate crimes, including violence against people based on their race or ethnicity or religion, gender, disabilities, sexual orientation. These rose nearly 12% between 2020 and 2021, just that period of time in the U.S.
Well, and of course, where this all really gets to is after you've othered people and dehumanized them, it's easy, next step to start killing them. And we've had horrendous instances of genocide in a lot of places, in Myanmar, in Darfur region of Sudan, in Rwanda, as we mentioned, Cambodia, just naming a few. But this has been with us for a long time, and it's still with us.
And I worry it is something we're going to have to increasingly face. We haven't talked a ton about this, but one of the drivers of othering or a seeking of belonging to a group that might be a form of malignant othering or malignant belonging, is sense of scarcity, perceived scarcity, fear and uncertainty. And as we talk a lot about at Post-Carbon Institute, if we're entering a period of what we've been calling the great unraveling of environmental systems like the climate system or social systems, that just heightens those tensions, that heightens that fear, heightens that uncertainty, heightens the at least perceived scarcity that people feel. And so the risk of othering is even more real, I think, now, and will be a more significant issue for us to contend with looking forward. It really, if there's a thing that keeps me up at night, this is...
Right. Yeah. I mean, we talk about coming together in times of crisis, but also we could fall apart in a time of crisis.
Well, I think there's a dichotomy there. So it's like if you are a society and you face an acute crisis, it's like I'm going to help my neighbor, whatever they look like, whoever they are. But if you are subject to chronic crises, I think that's more where you're going, Asher, with the great unraveling. It's like over and over and over again, you're hit with this. You probably lose that sense of cohesion pretty quick.
And you have people coming in to say, this is happening because of those people, right? So it's a combination of those, especially from people who want to maintain their power and the status quo for as long as possible, trying to deflect and saying we don't need to change the fundamental way that we operate society because that's what's brought us here. It's like, no, we can get back. We can make America great again if we deal with those people.
Rob, can you just pull out my copy over there of Green Eggs and Ham and just read it for a little bit?
Let's go back to West Tank.
All Alrighty, welcome to the Marvin Harris Memorial Lens of Doom section of the show. We're talking about cultural materialism, which is the theory that if you want to understand a society, you look at it 3 levels: the infrastructure, like the physical world, how they get the material needs, food, energy, etc. The structure, so that's the rules, both legal and social norms, and then the superstructure. These are the cultural belief systems, mythologies, stories they tell about themselves. Okay, so we're going to look at otherism or othering through these lenses, and we'll start with infrastructure. And I just want to repeat what we talked about earlier in the episode about our brain wiring. We are set up to differentiate and categorize. And this can be good. We need this, but it can be a precursor to othering. And so we got to worry about when we start treating people unfairly or being evildoers because of that differential view and treatment. Now, there's also something about, I think, the complexity of the world right now and the sheer scale of the planet. So there's 8 billion people. You can imagine how many affinity groups this ends up enabling, and the fact that we have mass communication. So you're dealing with this social complexity, which will, and this knowledge of it, which will tend to lead to the more capacity for othering.
Interestingly, it provides a lot more opportunity for people to identify themselves
belong,
with different groups,
right,
and belong to things, but also more groups to other.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about mass communication. I think another piece of the infrastructure is the media. First of all, you've got fractionated and opinionated and fear-mongering people all over the media landscape right now. And then couple that with the recent development of social media and the kind of silos and echo chambers that the algorithms there put people into.
Right.
And you've got a whole nother set of infrastructure that gives you a kind of leg up on othering.
Yeah. And again, thinking about infrastructure, we have forms of physical segregation as well, right? Often these have been a consequence of racism, redlining, how you build infrastructure, roads. We've talked about this before, putting highway systems in certain neighborhoods. But if you segregate how people live, sometimes it's voluntarily, sometimes it's not voluntarily, that reinforces this idea of separation.
Sure.
It reduces interaction between groups.
Right. Okay.
And then we also have a form of ableism, I guess you could say, in terms of infrastructure. And, the truth is that the physical world, the way we've actually built buildings, modes of transport, all these things have been designed for people that are ambulatory, people who are able to walk around and can see and hear.
Right.
And so that is a form of othering in a sense where maybe it's not intentional, but it's certainly not taking into consideration, or hasn't historically taken into consideration, people with different physical abilities.
Okay, so let's talk now about structure. This is the rules that help create or foster or reinforce othering. And there are laws, like structure, legal systems are a really important part of structure. And in Uganda right now, gay people, for example, are very much discriminated against. It can be life-threatening to be identified as gay. And so that's one of those sort of classes where legal systems can punish you.
Yeah, and look, I think we've made big strides in this country. It's not perfect, but we have changed a lot of the discriminatory laws that we've had in this country. Fortunately, they still exist in many other parts of the world. And just as one example, and it's not to pick on a particular culture necessarily, but, in Saudi Arabia, for example, if you drive down, and this is actually maybe even an infrastructure thing, you drive down the highway there, heading towards Mecca, for example, there's an exit that people have to take if you're a non-Muslim.
Okay.
Because you're not allowed to go into Mecca.
You can't go into the center of Mecca if you're not Muslim.
It's true othering infrastructure.
Yeah.
It's an exit. It's a piece of highway.
Exactly.
Amazing.
Interesting.
Well, you said here in the U.S. we've made progress. Certainly the civil rights era and the passing of a bunch of rights acts
voting
that tried to prevent putting people into these different classes and discriminating against them. But there's still vestiges from that, right? I mean, we still see things like a gender pay gap in this country, even though you're not legally allowed to discriminate in those sorts of ways. So these kinds of things can take a long time to work out, even if you do have remedies to the structural, the laws and the policies.
Okay, so now let's talk about superstructure. there's a lot that overlaps here with our episode on humanocentrism, right? This is sort of a belief in the superiority of your group versus, an inferiority of another group. So when you see that as sort of part of what's happening in your society, that's an example of superstructure. And so just think of the stories that may be told at the dinner table or about other groups.
Nationalism, we haven't talked about it, but that is in a sense a form of othering
Yeah,
as well. And
sure.
we certainly do that in this country, right? The story that America is number one, we're the best.
Now let's talk about some of that. I think this is another important part about it, the story that we tell ourselves as Americans, right? And there's an interesting kind of tension that arises. So we call ourselves this nation of immigrants. Along with this giant melting pot kind of idea, we have these libertarian projections of individual rights of expression. And sometimes we acknowledge, like, the heritage. It might be an Italian American or an Irish American, for example. And individuals vary in their tolerance to differences. We've talked about the big 5 personality traits and openness and how important that was. So this feeds then, I think, into cultural assimilation versus welcoming of plurality. So people are going to maybe have more tendency to see that immigrants are assimilating versus people are going to be more open to immigrants sort of maintaining their own identity and culture. And so there's a tension between this acceptance of diversity and the ease of governance and cohesion. So othering in certain circumstances may be a reaction by some against high rates of change that are increasing cultural diversity and the costs of the resulting complexity. And I think a good example you find is sort of school systems that are dealing with all the languages. So I think New York City schools have like 100 different languages, native languages that are in New York City schools. And so think about the cost of interacting with families when you have 100 different native languages you're trying to sort through. Mm-hmm. And this becomes a real challenge then on governance and the cost of complexity of cultural diversity.
Well, this is why we messed up on that episode on escaping technologyism, because that will solve your little language problem.
The little AIs are going to be just in the classrooms now helping translate. I think so. I think that's actually true.
Every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong. My life is the complete opposite of everything I want it to be.
If every instinct you have is wrong, then the opposite would have to be right.
All right. Thanks, George Costanza. A very simple starter for do the opposite is just don't other. So, Jason, no more hitting Dr. Dino upside the head. But
did
look,
we talk about how hard it is not to other?
It is hard. So if you're going to do it,
okay,
maybe being devoted to your sports team and othering your sports team's rivals is a kind of a benign way to do it.
Thank you.
I mean, it's a good point. I have to say,
throw me a bone.
Look, I went through a very hard time as a Red Sox fan growing up.
Yeah.
The Yankees are awesome.
I had my heart broken a bunch of times. And part of what fueled me was hating the hell out of the New York Yankees.
The Dodgers are my
fault. And I've lost something since the Red Sox won a bunch of World Series. I've lost that fire of like the other. It just doesn't mean as much to me
because you're a winner
anymore
now
to
too.
hate the Yankees. So I need to find another group of team or their fans to hate.
You mentioned that you lived in Philly as a kid. Like, this is the Philly sports fan. Yeah. It's not so much support for their team as hating all the other teams.
And Santa Claus.
Yeah.
But
let's also be careful because we know in sports this can go too far. You've seen racism in soccer.
Right.
You've seen soccer hooligans. I once read a book about that where there's all this extreme violence, in support of your team.
I saw Reggie Smith of the Dodgers beat up a Giants fan during the middle of a game.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
God. Okay, let's talk about visions for what doing the opposite might look like. And
besides rooting for a sports team, you mean?
Besides rooting for a sport. And I think you talked about don't other. Another opposite is belonging. Right? Belonging as the opposite of othering.
I can buy that.
So let's just define belonging for a minute. Belonging means having a meaningful voice and the opportunity to participate in the design of political, social, and cultural structures that shapes one's life. if you belong, then you have the right to both contribute and to make demands upon the society and political institutions. And so by this, we're talking about not just belonging to a small in-group, but belonging to society, more broadly. It's going outside of the completely homogeneous group.
Right.
And the idea of belonging is radical because it requires mutual power, right? It requires access for everyone, opportunity for all the groups and the individuals within a shared container. Right?
Yeah, that's it, right? It requires those with power to give up and share some of that.
Or just to say like, well, that's our goal. Our goal, we have power, but our goal is to be sharing that power and to listen to others. And I think we have to be very careful then about who we elect and do they have those values or not, I would say. Okay, the need to belong is, of course, fundamental and universal to human survival and flourishing. And so bonding is part of surviving and thriving as a human. And there's these consistent findings, right, of infants and children. You can have all the nutrients and physical care set up, but if you don't have love and emotional bonds, you're stunted in brain development and IQ and impulse control and emotional empathy, as well as your physical growth. So it's absolutely critical that people feel that they belong to something.
Okay, so if belonging is the opposite of othering and we're going to promote belonging, let's look at what are the elements, what makes it up. And I read from the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley that there are 4 elements. Okay, so the first of these is that belonging requires inclusion. This is probably the most obvious. But something I want to point out is you can be included somewhere, but still feel like you don't belong. So including is sort of a necessary step, but it certainly isn't sufficient. An example would be, Jason, you belong to a male-only tennis club,
you
right?
Do?
What are you talking about?
It's not. Let's pretend it was the 1930s and it was male-only.
Okay.
And you started inviting women to participate.
They can play sports?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, you don't get into trouble.
I'm pretending it's the 1930s.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I'm being ridiculous.
But that's the thing. If women are treated as outsiders or tokenized or even you're expected to serve as kind of the representative of all women everywhere, then we're not really getting past othering at that point. But,
right, I understand.
But it's the first step, is including.
Mixed doubles is a great game.
It is.
It's fine, okay?
So belonging, that's one element. Belonging also requires a sense of connection. And of course, that's subjective. But when an institution or an organization or a community engenders feelings of attachment and fondness, safety, warmth, that creates that sense of connection and belonging that's really critical for people.
And it also requires visibility or recognition. And my wife tells me this all the time, but the simple act of being seen, heard, and understood can be quite powerful for making people feel that their social group is respected and valued.
And I think this is particularly true for groups that have been long marginalized.
Yeah.
And there can be, often situations for people where, because they've never really felt that they had a voice at the table, it's not just a matter of saying, oh, now you have a voice. It's really trying to encourage that and creating a sense of trust. That gets back to that sense of connection. Because people need to feel like they can actually trust to be able to feel recognized.
Yes.
Okay, so we've got inclusion, we've got connection, we've got visibility or recognition. And then the fourth element, maybe stepping it up even farther, is agency. Belonging requires agency. And that means that people have a voice and a say. They have a meaningful degree of influence over how the group or the institution operates. And it doesn't mean that when people who are formerly marginalized come into the group, that any demand or anything they ask is going to automatically be incorporated or change the group. But it does mean that it would be considered that you would
legitimate.
Yeah, you would have a legitimate listening, weighing, and then, maybe you would have a compromise or an amendment to how the group operates. But that agency is key for belonging.
So part of doing the opposite to othering or otherism is practicing anti-othering. So we should talk a little bit about what that looks like. And I would say it begins with a commitment to not just tolerating or respecting differences, but to ensuring that all people are welcome and that they feel like they belong in society. It's an active form. It's not a passive form of ensuring that that people are feeling comfortable and welcomed?
Yeah, I think all of the anti-othering that we can suggest is you have to be active. And one of the ways you can be active is to challenge and reject negative representations and stereotypes of other social groups. You know, you hear something, see something, then you kind of got to speak out. And on the flip side of that, be welcoming to out groups. Send them messages that they belong, that they're welcome in your community, in your society.
And there has been a lot of legislation in the United States that help make groups that formerly have been othered feel more included and belong. And so, for example, is legislation like the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and that has helped change the actual infrastructure to allow people with differences in physical abilities to gain access to public spaces, right? And this is something that's all actually in progress. Like, we haven't instantly changed our infrastructure, and you'll see there's projects in your community to help with this and support those.
But really cool too, from a Marvin Harris perspective, right? Like, you're changing that infrastructure, it can help change our culture and our beliefs and certainly the policies and rules.
Now, anti-othering can sometimes require or force people in situations that they're being othered to stand up for themselves. And an example of that is a story that was recounted in that book, Rob, that you talked about. In 2018, a white woman in the city of Oakland called the police on two black men. They were holding a cookout along the edge of Lake Merritt there in the city. And the incident occurred against a really tense backdrop. You know, Oakland had been going through a period of gentrification. It had been historically a real African-American community. And because of gentrification, it had transitioned a bit from being predominantly black to being predominantly white over that decade. And the response to this incident was a community of people organizing a series of events that they call Barbecue and While Black, where they demanded essentially equal access to the lakeside area. There was a social media campaign that was hashtag We Still Here. And that was, you know, with the goal of creating a more equitable and inclusive local community. But it's really important. It shouldn't be just on those who are being othered in a situation or marginalized to stand up for themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, we do want a situation where people feel empowered to do something like that. But those of us who are not in a position where we're being marginalized or othered, it's on us to stand up as well. And sometimes it's about standing up in solidarity, and sometimes it's actually standing forward proactively ourselves when we see something happening, as you talked about, Rob.
Yeah, I really like that story. And there are definite times when you have to stand up. I have a story. I watched this TED Talk from this guy, Christian Picciolini. I hope I pronounced that right. But his is not so much about standing up. It's more about the deep listening and empathy side of things. So this guy, he was kind of an othered young person. He came from an immigrant family. I think he didn't really fit in, and he found himself as one of these troubled, wandering teens. And he got scooped up into essentially a white supremacist gang. And all through his time growing up and into his early adulthood, he was tatted up with white supremacist tattoos, and he ran a book and record store that, you know, sold, you know, all kinds of racist crap. Anyway, he was able to get out of it, and he ended up helping 100 other people disengage from white supremacy extremist groups. And he didn't do this by arguing or debating them, you know, taking a page out of Jason's book and dealing with creationists.
I knew you were going to say that.
I know. I'm sorry.
I was so young at the time.
But yeah, we all kind of know that. You're not going to convince somebody who's irrational to suddenly be rational by pointing it out to them. So what he does is he draws people in and he listens for the problems in their life, what he calls the potholes, and he helps fill them in so that they can develop skills, self-confidence, so that they can rely on that rather than finding scapegoats and othering people. And, you know, he realized that people often participate in othering simply because they want to belong to a community like we were talking about. And so, you know, his deal is if you can find someone who is undeserving of your compassion and give it to them, they're probably the ones who need it the most, and you might help stop them from othering.
Yeah. Well, I guess this leads to then another way we can help is by supporting what we would call benign belonging. And so these are groups, associations that aren't going to be engaged in othering like white supremacist groups, and breathe life into these institutions. America in the early 20th century experienced this period of building all these groups, like the Lions Club or whatever, and neighborhood associations, the formation of colleges and universities. And now we are in a decline of a lot of these institutions. So how to rebuild existing institutions or create new ones, more applicable to today, affinity groups that are really pro-social.
And actually, what you're just talking about, Jason, really connects, I think, to what you were saying, Rob, when you're talking about the story of that guy, Christian, which is a lot of those associations that were in communities actually help provide for basic needs that their members had. They were the social safety net before we had things like insurance or Social Security or any of those kinds of things. And it gets to supporting people with their material needs. And if we lift people up, in a sense, to provide them with a floor of safety and security, it may reduce the risk of them falling prey to othering or blaming others. So I think that's a really important one. It's weird to bring this up, but the military, which is not an institution I typically think of as benign belonging.
Yeah, we've recommended demilitarizing, right?
But they have done a pretty amazing job of bonding people together across lots of differences, right?
Yeah.
They've managed diversity throughout their ranks. They've done this by setting 4 conditions: equal status, intergroup cooperation, common goals, and support by social and institutional authorities. They draw from every sector of society, but often from the least privileged sectors, right? And it becomes a practical necessity in their case to tamp down on ethnic and racial divisions and to foster belonging. And that's partly by having a shared vision, a shared mission, a shared sense of purpose, which I think is also what people are seeking very much in life. I might not align with the mission of the military in all cases, but sort of the ingredients that are used
how to do it.
How to do it, I think is really worth looking at. And it'd be wonderful if we actually adopted some of the structures or the processes that the military has employed to either redirect the military infrastructure to doing things like rebuilding America, building community
ecological restoration or social justice.
Well, I actually think there's a system in place for doing that already called AmeriCorps. And I remember meeting a group of AmeriCorps volunteers. I don't know, maybe there was 10 of them, and these are people in their late teens to early 20s. Very diverse group, and they were wonderful. They had a sense of cohesion. They travel around a certain region, and they'll spend weeks to months at a time doing work related to ecological restoration and social justice. Honestly, it was quite amazing. So what if they had the budget that was more of the military scale budget, and that was your service to your country?
It's funny. I've often thought I missed out on doing something like that because it does feel like such an opportunity to belong to something greater than yourself and probably come away with just best buddies, right?
Right.
Okay, well, in trying to engender belonging and trying to anti-other, is that a verb? I guess so. Let's remind ourselves that we're not necessarily talking about getting rid of differences, and we're not talking about building some homogenous society. We're saying it's okay to have distinct groups out there, but to try to push down or tamp down that othering that can happen, you got to build bridges among these different groups. And so the idea of bridging is it's a practice where members of different social groups are not just brought into contact, but you have a chance to build actual social connections, build rapport with one another. And you can think of some examples like hosting interfaith dinners or having a multicultural concert, doing various leadership trainings. I don't know. There's a lot of ways that you can build these bridges. But the key to it all really is that you have to be there with listening, and you have to be there to learn about the people who are perceived as being the other. You're not listening just to figure out what are the facts here? You're listening to affirm their humanity. Maybe gets back to some of that validation, that feeling that we were talking about when we were describing the elements of belonging.
Let me give you an example of sort of a project or process that represents this. It's called Marnita's Table, and it uses the dinner table as a means for bringing people together and solving some of the community's biggest, toughest issues. And there was a food, as a denominator for this event, these Marnita's Tables events. And this was founded in 2006 by husband and wife team, Marnita Schrodel and Carl Goldstein. And the mission is to bridge cultural, generational, and socioeconomic differences. So the way this works is that a community or an organization recommends a topic of concern, could be race, isolation of refugees, graduation rates, and then staff and volunteers from Marnita's Table set up the table. They create an intimate dinner. It may be the home of these hosts or one of the many volunteers. And then the meal is a big part of it. There are also cards with questions on them. They're spread around. It's not so much designed to talk about your problems. Instead, it's designed to talk about what you have in common. And so the smallest group that has happened at these Marnita's Tables events has been 12, and up to 150 people have been at their home at one time.
Yeah, it's a stunningly simple and stunningly awesome example, I think. You just get people together to discuss the issues and having a good meal together. I mean, what's not to like about that?
Yeah.
To me, this speaks to the listening that we've been talking about and the need for building our capacity to practice empathetic listening. And there's an organization actually that I was involved with years ago called Listening for a Change that really sought to do that. They trained volunteers in the community to specifically go out and to interview others in the community that were different than them. And part of it was an educational project where they created posters or videos that showcased the stories of the people that were interviewed, just to kind of remind people in the community, these are members of our community that maybe are invisible to you. You don't understand them, or they look different. But when you can hear a conversation with them, you understand that there's a lot of commonality there. But to me, the key thing about the project was this skill building of learning how to be an empathetic listener, which is something we unfortunately don't really teach people to do. We teach them a lot of hard facts in school. We don't teach kids or even adults how to listen with deep inquiry,
Yeah.
And an example of that is this is a very simple practice, is you ask an open-ended question versus a closed question.
Right.
You don't look for a yes or no answer. You ask them a question that opens up a story. This is especially true when people may not feel that comfortable, but you're listening, you're creating a safe space for them to really express themselves in a genuine and authentic way.
I missed that training because I find I'm more of an empathetic talker than an empathetic listener.
Yeah, you're great at it.
I do think that familiarity and empathy are some of the kind of antidotes to othering, but one of the other ones, I think it maybe ties in with the military or maybe better with the AmeriCorps idea that you were sharing, Jason, is that you need to focus sometimes on what are called superordinate goals. So that's the kind of objectives that people across differences care about. Like everybody together can agree on, some value or some work that they want to achieve together. And to overcome othering and to have belonging, then we got to find those. We have to engage in work where we realize a shared vision. Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, I think the military maybe is one of our better examples of that.
I want to share something about the Needham Resilience Network, which is a project that was started by one of our advisors, Nicole Argo, who's worked for a very long time in the realm of othering and belonging. And she was responding to some incidents that were happening in her community in Massachusetts that were really around hate crimes and division of that kind, identity-based stuff. And the project, it's not actually set up to specifically address this or that issue. It's really around, in some ways, creating a council that's outside of the city council. She has brought together representatives from different stakeholder groups in the community, and they meet on a regular basis together. The people that are there in this council are trusted representatives of the communities that they're there to represent, in a sense. And what they do is explore topics that are relevant to them, and they build this kind of relational tissue and bring in a different perspective on whatever topics that they're exploring at the time. And the purpose is to really show that, and this could be ethnic groups, but it could also be groups that are working on different issues, healthcare or faith-based communities, to recognize that working on these issues together is what's going to be key for them to be able to resolve them as a community. And it's that relational tissue that, and this is part of why it's called a resilience network, allows a community to be more resilient in the face of coming shocks or challenges that they may face. And I would say for our listeners, we've talked about different examples of doing this, of building relationships. We talked about mutual aid networks. All these things are really key. We talked about it from the standpoint of when you build those relationships, you strengthen social ties and social cohesion. It allows a community to be more resilient in the face of the crises that we face. But it also addresses this othering issue, right? And if we're able to do both things at the same time, in a sense, through working together across differences on stuff, we're in a better position, I think, to respond, to tamp down on one and to build a capacity to do the other.
Yeah, it's clear that it takes a lot of organizing effort to do something like this. So we have a lot of work to do. So
yeah, I'll say there's a lot of work to do. And I think I can simplify things quite a bit. The best way to get an in-group tight and cohesive and working together is to create an even bigger out-group.
Oh.
And so you remember the Arthur C. Clarke Childhood's End?
Yeah.
Yeah.
no.
Well, it's the space aliens show up and, it's kind of like, oh, that other is more powerful than all of humanity. And they tamp down on all of our bullshit and just have all this technology to keep us from fighting each other. So we just need to get those...
We need to invent a space race. So the risk of an alien species.
Well, that's the thing. If we can't rely on them showing up, we just got to make them, right?
Let's get the AI on it.
Exactly.
Have you guys learned nothing?
That's our show. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard and you want others to consider these issues, then please share Crazy Town with your friends. Hit that share button in your podcast app or just tell them face to face. Maybe you can start some much needed conversations and do some things together to get us out of Crazy Town. Thanks again for listening and sharing.
Managing rallies and long-term protest encampments requires robust security. But how can we know who's a trusted ally versus who should be kept out of our safe zones? With Solidarity Pass. Solidarity Pass is an advanced AI that combines top-end facial recognition with large language model networks that have scrubbed the online history of every single person on the planet to yield the ultimate security-minded database. With a Solidarity Pass app on your smartphone, a simple picture will tell you within seconds if the person seeking entry to your rally or encampment is a friend with historically appropriate ideas or a dangerous outsider like the police, members of the security state, or fans of corned beef. Solidarity Pass makes it easy for you to set up screening criteria with quick and intuitive drop-down identity menus. Here's what our users say. We are now able to run the kinds of background checks the way oppressive police, who should be defunded immediately, used to, allowing our progressive security forces to screen entrance to our campus safe zone. Solidarity Pass is awesome. Look, we know Antifa is following us, trying to infiltrate our peaceful patriotic gatherings. But with Solidarity Pass, we are able to keep the fascist communists out of our rallies. No more disruptions, only good times glorifying God and country. Solidarity Pass, keeping everyone who disagrees with us at a safe enough distance so that we can protest them in peace.
Crazy town, da 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 da, crazy town.